This video is a brief introduction into FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This largely relates to how FIFRA applies or is associated with forestry practices such as forest silviculture conducted in forest nurseries, and it can even apply to, say, trees in an urban setting or residential setting in a park as well. The premise applies to all of them. So FIFRA was originally, say, enacted or developed in 1947, and there have been some revisions over time to it. And I believe even, say, around 2008, there was some slight modifications. And we're only going to mention a few aspects of FIFRA. Obviously, as you know, FIFRA is a large act, as well as everybody associated with taxes, and there's an interpretation to this. There's an interpretation to labels, etc. So FIFRA largely relates to relates to the use of pesticides and the labeling and making sure that you follow the label instructions. So we're concerned here with this part here often, right, for restricted use, properly managed pesticide storage, the disposal of pesticides, etc. And so, obviously, it's related to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. But there are certain parts of it, certain sections that we are most concerned about. Say, for instance, Section 3. This is the National Registration of Pesticides. No person in any state may distribute or sell to any person any pesticide that is not registered pursuant to Section 3 of FIFRA. So it largely relates to the registration of pesticides. Another one that we're often concerned about is Section 24. This is Special Local Needs 24C registrations. If you've seen labels with 24C, that relates to Section 24 of FIFRA. Section 18 is here as well. That's for, say, like emergency condition situations. And another part is Section 2EE. So now we can look at a PDF version of FIFRA. And so here is FIFRA, effective May 22nd, 2008. And you can see here that it is broken down into sections. The ones that we're most concerned about in forestry often is Section 2 to some extent, but the large ones are Section 3, registration of pesticides, your national labels for pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, and in Section 24, the authority of the states. And you could have a Section 18 become an issue at some point. And even Section 2EE. And even these other sections, say like the use of restricted use pesticides, Section 11 and Section 12, unlawful acts. Obviously, all of this relates to some extent to us, but the main ones, as I said, are Section 3 and Section 24. So we can just scroll down here real quick. First, we'll look at Section 2, the definitions, page 7. And you may have heard of Section 2EEs, and that's what this is about. So this is Section 2. Here's your EE, to use any registered pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. And we can scroll down to Section 2EE. And first, I'll come here to Section 2. Here is Section 2, and then it has these little subsections, I guess you could call them. And if we scroll down to EE, and you can see to use any registered pesticide in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. So it goes through and describes this here. Any use of a pesticide in conformance with section 5, 18, or 24. So 24 is often a section that we're interested in. Special local needs, 24C. Section 2 EEs are often advantageous or beneficial because they allow for interpretations or clarifications of labels or of a registration of a pesticide without having to go through the whole formal process, the research, the registration, the whole process of that registration associated, say, with Section 3 or 24Cs. So, for instance, it allows pesticide companies to interpret their label. It's beneficial because decisions can be made about gray areas based on data and not opinion. And companies can use this as an educational tool. And, as I said, it's not considered a registration, but an interpretation or clarification. As I mentioned, many of our laws are greatly interpretation. So what would be an example of a 2EE? Let's say a chemical was registered for loblolly pine, and it was said it could control certain beetles. But let's say we have a new beetle that comes about, and it's not on that Section 3 or a 24C label, but the chemical is registered to be used on loblolly pine, but we find out that it can control this beetle, but it's not registered for that beetle. So my understanding is as long as you don't exceed the registered rate, say on a Section 3 or 24C label, and as long as it's registered using a particular chemical, a particular application manner, you can use it to control that beetle. And this is great because that company, or say some agency, such as the Southern Forest Nursery Management Cooperative, I believe, they could even kind of start this 2EE process to educate folks about the use to control this beetle without having to go through the whole Section 3 or 24C process. So here's an example where a product is effective against a pest that's not on the label, or to apply a chemical using, say, a wick rather than a nozzle. Neither of these are prohibited, but they're not on the label either. They're not necessarily approved. But you cannot add a new site, say, forest nursery. So if it was registered in a plantation, you can't add forest nurseries using the 2EE without having to, say, go back through the whole 24C you could do, or even the Section 3. But that would obviously be for one site, that would be a lot of work. And then there's various aspects that are beneficial, right? The review process, the costs are pretty much null. The problem is, though, it varies by state, making sure that the 2EE is consistent with each state. And that can obviously be a problem when you're trying to do a 2EE, say, for a region. So what is a site? Well, as I mentioned, most things associated with regulations or laws with pesticides is somewhat of an interpretation. We usually think of site as a crop or a location of a crop, not necessarily a specific farm or forest, but more like a plantation versus a nursery versus a yard setting. So for instance, in terms of a crop, there is obviously a difference of applying a pesticide, say in cotton versus a pecan orchard versus, say, a loblolly pine. And in terms of site, or more kind of location, we can think of it as a pine plantation versus a pine nursery versus, say, a pine tree in a yard. And there could even be some differences. A site in terms of a pesticide and FIFRA could potentially even be some type of application procedure, but usually it's a crop or kind of a condition or a state or a location or a kind of a setting, as I said, like a plantation versus a nursery. Why is that? Well, you can imagine if you know much about pine, say, we know there's a pretty big difference between applying a herbicide often, for most herbicides, not all, but most herbicides, between, say, like a 1-year-old pine versus a 25-year-old pine, the tolerance associated with that, and even the application method associated with that can differ. You can imagine, say, an application in a yard setting versus a pine plantation versus a nursery. So even in a nursery, you can think of the nutrient status of the nursery or the growing condition of the tree, the seedling, versus, say, a 25-year-old pine plantation, particularly on like a sandy site. In a nursery, fertilization, it's irrigated, and often fertilization can sometimes can interact with certain herbicides, pesticides. So there's a different condition going there between, say, a nursery and a pine plantation, and even a yard setting, particularly where the tree may be located within a yard. And also it relates to the impact to wildlife, to domestic animals, pets. Right? Obviously a yard setting is different in terms of pets, for the most part, relative to a plantation. And even domestic animals, say like cattle or sheep. And even to us, right? And you can even think of it like the setting of an urban yard, what plants may be around that tree, grass versus, say, a pine plantation or nursery. Those different conditions. So those are kind of, once again, everybody, those kind of define a site. And you can imagine, as I mentioned throughout this whole video, the interpretation of that. Well, this is a different site than this. So some are pretty obvious. To me, a nursery, a pine nursery, is much different than a yard tree, than a loblolly pine on a yard tree. Now, nursery, here's one that could be a little bit, right? Is a pine nursery different than a hardwood nursery? Probably. Most people, it may just be a nursery, okay? But when you get right down to it, there's some pretty likely substantial differences between those two nurseries that can maybe, certainly for many pesticides, require you to say that's a whole different site than this site. And that can be a little problematic in terms of 24Cs, even 2EEs, right? But 24Cs and Section 3s in terms of the cost of stating the efficacy of this chemical to control this problem or to help this crop grow, as well as its impact to wildlife, say like the LD50s and things like that, and to humans. So the site can create some problems sometimes, depending on your perspective. Here's an example of a Section 3 label, potentially a 24C, and then a Section 2EE. This is Cobra. Lactofen is the active ingredient. And it was a big herbicide in forest nurseries when I worked with the Auburn Southern Forest Nursery Management Cooperative from around 2001 to 3, and I believe it's still used widely. So we can click here on the label. This is the Section 3, and you can see here's Cobra. The active ingredient is lactofen, and then here's your EPA registration. So this is your Section 3, meaning it's the national registration. And you can go through here, and of course you should you should follow the labeling, the label that's part of FIFRA. And so what we can do is we can come down here to where it's used for forest nurseries. And here you can see directions for outdoor use in conifer seedlings and nurseries. And so this is the national label, and it has different application types and rates: post-emergence, pre-emergence. And you can see that it's labeled for certain species. So this is the section 3. So my understanding is you could use it on loblolly pine, whether it was in the southeast or say if it was in the Lake States. I think you could use it on loblolly pine. I'm just making a statement, everybody. I'm not saying to grow loblolly in the Lake States, but it's the national label. And this is where it gets kind of interpretation. I don't believe if there's a species not here, I don't believe you can use it for that species in a nursery setting. Now, you could still use it. It'd be illegal, and would you get caught? Maybe not. But the problem is if there was ever some type of health issue or something associated, maybe you killed all the seedlings, and who would be responsible for that? That's why you always want to use the pesticide appropriately, given the certain site or condition that you can use it in and the application rate, because it can always come back to you legally, and I've seen where that's been an issue, and the costs associated with the liability, who was liable for certain problems. So here's the post-emergence applications to conifer seedlings, and it lists the weeds that are controlled. This would be an example, say, of like a 2EE. Let's say there was some species, some weed that's not on here, but you found out that this chemical now controls that weed. Well, you could do a 24C, or you could do a Section 3. I guess you could revise this whole Section 3 process, not nurseries, but the whole Section 3. Or you could do a 2EE. As long as it was, say, in a nursery setting, loblolly pine, it's already registered there as Section 3. And even in a 24C, I believe. But this is, if it was a 24C situation, the 2EE could still apply. But it's already registered for loblolly nursery setting at the Section 3. So you could make a pesticide company, and maybe even a trade agency, say the nursery co-op, could even put together a 2EE with the state and say it can control this other weed that's not on the label. And that would help people learn about that control of that weed using Cobra or Lactofen. And then also, everybody, here's an actual example of a 2EE. This is in Texas. Remember, the 2EEs and the 24Cs are by state, and that can be, sometimes it can be a little problematic addressing all the particular processes of each state. And here you can see the 2EE. This is the 2EE, the FIFRA Section 2EE for Cobra herbicide plus this other herbicide plus glyphosate for post-emergence and residual weed control in soybeans. And this is just an example, an actual example of a 2EE. What would be an example of a 24C? Well, let's say in North Carolina, South Carolina, it was found that this chemical was also safe for Table Mountain pine. And you can see it's not labeled here on pine. So when Table Mountain pine was grown in the nurseries, I don't believe legally, and this is where you get into interpretation, I don't believe legally you could use it on Table Mountain pine. Now, as I said, you could use it, but if something happened to the Table Mountain pine, who's liable for that problem, whether it be health issues or financial problems? And that's where, once again, you want to use the label in accordance with, you want to apply the pesticide in accordance with the label. But that would be where you could have like a 24C. You wouldn't have to have, say, the whole Section 3 redone for the whole country because it can be used in North Carolina and South Carolina on Table Mountain pine. Well, I don't want to redo the whole Section 3, the whole financial process of Valent doing the whole thing again. So you could just do a 24C in North Carolina and South Carolina. Remember, they're two separate states, so you have to go through each process within the state and get it registered for Table Mountain pine just in those two states. Section 3, the registration of pesticides, and this is your national label and how that relates to the national, to use nationally. And then you have special local needs like in the 24C. But here is your Section 3, and this is your national labeling, as I said. And you can go through, obviously this is a pretty large act and a pretty large document that you could read about it. So there's Section 3, and then the other one that we're often most interested in is Section 24, so page 88, the authority of the states, and that's for special local needs. So the authority of states. So as I said, Section 3 is the national label, and that often requires quite a bit of research, quite a bit of documentation. And then there's Section 24, and this is a special local needs, where, say, certain states may have the chemical can be used in a certain type, a certain condition, certain situation to address a certain pest that was not on the Section 3 label. And to avoid having to redo the whole Section 3 label and all that involves, states can have special registrations just for that state. And that can create a problem sometimes too, everybody, because if it does work in a certain situation or type on a certain pest, and it's not on the Section 3, well then each state has to kind of go through and do the 24C process. And that can be a little problematic, you can imagine. But nonetheless, it's also very beneficial because you can register chemicals, pesticides, without having to go through the whole Section 3 process. This is the Mississippi Department of Agriculture and Commerce website and the Bureau of Plant Industry within that agency. And you can see the Section 24C registrations. So the Bureau has the authority from the U.S. EPA under Section 24C of FIFRA to register a pesticide for use only in Mississippi. This type of registration is based on the determination of a special local need as defined under guidelines and regulations adopted by EPA. Special local need is justified when an EPA registered product, Section 3, is not available or registered for the requested use, or an EPA registered product is not as safe, practical, and useful as an unregistered product. And there's some interpretation associated with that, and there are some potential issues. And that's where, everybody, it's just an introduction into FIFRA and the 24C section registrations. Here's an example of a 24C. This is reflex herbicide. Fungicide is the active ingredient. This is Syngenta. So we can look at the current EPA Section 3. This is the national label, the Section 3. And you can scroll down through here. Here's your Fungicide, and here's your EPA. This is your Section 3 registration. And as we scroll through here, you can see regional applications, potential applications of this pesticide. So it's the national label. And what is nice about this pesticide, at least for this example, is we can come back over here, we can go to the special label, and we click there and we scroll down and we can go to Mississippi. And here you can see a Section 24C. So this is a special local needs. And this is for control of yellow nutsedge in pine seed nurseries, pine seedling nurseries. So that is a special local need. There's other southeastern states as well, but this may not necessarily be applicable, say, to Oregon or something like that for pine in Oregon. But it's for control of nutsedge here in the southeast United States. So we can download that, and we can see here for Mississippi, only within the state of Mississippi, because remember, this 24C, the special local need, is by state, similar to the 2EE. It really only applies within Mississippi. And if you wanted this to use reflex for nutsedge in pine seedling nurseries in other states, you'd have to go through the specific states. But I just wanted to show you, here's a section 24C, if you've seen that, and then only in Mississippi, and then it describes it here. But of course, the important thing is that you have to have the section 3, the national registration, to begin with, and then you can have the special local needs. So this was never the control of the yellow nutsedge and pine seedling nurseries was never part of the section 3 label. So this pesticide, this herbicide, was never registered not only for the control of yellow nutsedge and pine seedling nurseries, but for pine seedling nurseries in general. And that's why you need the 24C, because if it was already registered section 3 for pine seedling nurseries, but it was not specifically stated on the label it could control yellow nutsedge, and it did control yellow nutsedge, you could do the 2EE. But here you have to do the 24C because pine seedling nurseries is not on the section 3. So if I go over here back to the section 3 reflex, and I come up and I search for pine, you can see there's nothing coming up for pine outside of lupin. And if I type in even nursery, okay, there's nothing coming up in relation to nurseries. And that's because, as I said, everybody, it was never registered for pine nurseries at the section 3 to begin with, and that's why you need to have the 24C, because it's another site use. Section 2EEs are more for clarifications or interpretations of, say, section 3, and I believe even section 24Cs. And then there are section 18 registrations, and probably these are very rare. And would they ever be associated with forestry? Probably pretty low probability. These are for emergency situations. Now, when would a pesticide potentially be registered through a section 18 or be allowed to be used, say, through section 18? Remember, like in 2001, I think roughly, there was the anthrax scare. Perhaps a pesticide, perhaps anthrax got way out of hand, and maybe we found that there was a pesticide that was effective against it. But yet at the same time, what's all the research behind it, etc. But it's an emergency situation, so you probably wouldn't have the time to go through a section 3 or 24C, and it's not even registered yet, so you couldn't do a 2EE. That's where maybe a section 18 could come about. Now for forestry, maybe something like, let's say we had a massive outbreak of southern pine beetle and it just started really destroying large amounts of acreage of pine. Well, maybe there's some chemical that we found out controls it very well, but it's not registered. That chemical is not registered for pine. Or maybe it's not even registered at all through a section 3. So that could be a situation where maybe that's a situation where I could maybe see where it could be used. This publication does a good job of distinguishing between a 24C and a section 18. You may say, well, can't you do a section 18, say, for some pest in the nursery and call that an emergency? Well, not really. There's a variety of reasons why not. But, and this publication is developed by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. And it clarifies on the SLNs, Special Local Needs, or 24Cs, that a first party, the applicant, who can apply to the EPA for 24C. Well, that can be the registrant of the product, say the chemical company, or it could be somebody like a grower or grower association. And when I was with the nursery co-op at Auburn, we were involved with getting 24Cs, and who was going to submit that? Was it going to be the nursery co-op the kind of the growers, right, the nurseries, or was it going to be the chemical company? And sometimes there are some issues, I believe, even legally as to who, right, what's the liability associated with the registrants. But here you can kind of see it's a good table showing the difference between a 24C and a Section 18, and I'm not going to go into detail in here. But see the Section 18, no tolerance yet established. USPA will establish a time-limited tolerance. That's kind of what I was talking about with the Section 3 and the 24C. The Section 3 particularly, it's a pretty long process to go through, and you have to do research. And so the Section 18 is something, an emergency. We don't have the time to go through that whole process, and so therefore we're going to register it quickly under the Section 18, and that obviously can have some problems as well. But there's a limited amount of time. I believe the expiration date not to exceed 1 year, except for quarantine exemptions. Whereas the 24C and a Section 3 are essentially, right, endless, as long as you don't have to have some type of re-registration or some of that chemical. But the Section 18 is only for emergencies, and in my understanding for short durations, to address that emergency situation or condition.